UN News.
Our ancestor, Kwame Ture. Um, this is a clip that we pulled. I guess he spoke about this in the 90s. Um, he has he has a very optimistic view of people becoming more conscious post 60s in regards to African liberation. So let's play the clip and I can ask you the question in a minute.
You're arguing that fundamental revolution really needs to be thought out very carefully.
It has to be properly planned. Revolt, rebellion is not thought out, but revolution is. Revolt, rebellion only seeks to vent the anger against the system, but revolution seeks power. And I've been on power since I was a kid, and I haven't changed yet. We need power, and revolution is what brings power. You seize power at revolution.
Where do you see things going then? Are you encouraged? Are you saying that you're encouraged by what you see here in the United States among our people?
It's a classical English statement. It's the worst of times and the best of times. It's the best of times because our people are more conscious. They're more conscious today than ever before. Even though there's a large unconscious sector, but we know that with a conscious sector determined, that unconscious sector can become politicized overnight, as they did in the 1960s, as they did in the Russian Revolution, as they did everywhere else. They can become politicized overnight and join the sides actively for the fight for humanity. So that's not our problem. We are very conscious. So when you have the best of times, which is the rising consciousness of people, and the worst of times, which is the conditions rolling back the gains that we want, etc., when you have rising consciousness and worsening conditions, you've got to have a revolt, an explosion. But this one, we want to be revolution, not a rebellion, where we actually seize power.
Do you agree with his sentiment in terms of, as he said, the best of times and the worst of times? Like, in terms of Pan-Africanism today, like, how do you feel about the movement now? And I know you explained about this a little bit in terms of the continent, but like in the Caribbean, in the West in general, like, where do you feel we kind of fall within that?
Yeah, so that's interesting because in my experience within the Pan-African movement, I would tend to agree with his point about the elevated consciousness of our people, that over the several years of the Pan-African work that I've done, I've received a very positive reception towards Pan-Africanism. I was actually surprised when I first started doing the work that I wasn't getting a whole lot of pushback. When I discussed Pan-Africanism with people that tried to build in different spaces around Pan-Africanism, that I didn't have to do too much explaining or too much convincing in terms of Pan-Africanism and why it's important. So I think the consciousness of African people do gravitate towards Pan-Africanism. And a point that Kwame Ture had made that I remember, because it's an interesting point that is still relevant today, that in Africa, there's no African leader that will come outright and say that they're against Pan-Africanism or that they're against African unity, because the consciousness of the people gravitates so strongly towards unity that even leaders who don't believe in Pan-Africanism will have to lie to the people and tell them that they believe in Pan-Africanism. It's the same thing in Caribbean politics, that you won't find too many Caribbean leaders that will tell you they're against Caribbean unity or Caribbean integration, that the consciousness of the people want that unity so much that the leaders will lie and say that they support unity, even though their policies are actually against unity. So I do agree that the consciousness of the people does gravitate towards that unity. But the problem, and this is something that I've been confronted with my own work, is how do we organize the people around that? How do we build movements around that? Africa has been encouraging to me because within the last decade or so, we have seen uprisings in Africa. But as Kwame Ture said, a rebellion is not a revolution. So a lot of times these rebellions, these uprisings aren't particularly coordinated. They're not particularly well planned, and too often they end up fizzling out when the anger of the people subsides. But it seems to be a bit different in the United States and in the Caribbean, that particularly in the United States, Black Lives Matter did an effective job at mobilizing people enough to have those protests and riots and having people go out in the streets to vent their anger. But there was never any coordinated movement behind it. So I think, unfortunately, what happened was Black Lives Matter fizzled out. And at the moment, we really don't see a large national movement that's actually able to mobilize people in that way. And Kwame Ture always spoke about the difference between organization and
Hmm.
mobilization, that people, when they're angry, they'll mobilize, they'll go to the streets and protest and engage in that sort of behavior. But if there's no organization behind it, there's no permanent organization, then once the anger subsides, the people go back to being inactive. And as I pointed out, since Black Lives Matter has more or less faded from the national consciousness in the United States, we're not really seeing a national movement designed to advocate for the rights of Black people in that way. And one of the critiques I had of Black Lives Matter at the time is I felt Black Lives Matter was it was a great slogan, but it was too decentralized. There wasn't a solid central organization behind it. So I think it was inevitable that the Black Lives Matter movement would fade the way that it did. It's hard to sustain a movement when you don't have that level of organization. And we have a similar problem in the Caribbean, where we don't have a sustained organization behind any of the demands for change taking place there.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned how in Africa there is, and I think that's just part of the social makeup in terms of there's more openness to unity. Even for me, visiting and living in Uganda for a few months back in 2011, like even though, well, I guess in a lot of ways I was a foreigner, obviously living in the West, but to the people there I wasn't, so it was kind of like this in between, especially, but I think once I continued visiting again over the course of within a decade, like about 5 times in the same place, like they were a lot more. The first time was kind of shaky because they were trying to figure out um, who I was. But I think mostly in terms of they were wondering, oh, this person is just going to come and visit this one time and never come back and we won't see him again. But when I kind of proved to them, that I was intentional about them and intentional about who they were and visited multiple times since, then they began to open up. And that was when, I was able to have those connections and relationships and having these type of discussions with them, especially as I was mostly working with teens at first, but then as they got older, like, and especially with like the people that were kind of overseeing them were predominantly white. By the time they got older, I was able to kind of share more of the reality of America that the white people weren't necessarily able or were willing to tell them. So I definitely found that, in being there, and I say this like every time I've gone to Africa, that's when I feel the most free, in terms of my state of being. Conversely, growing up in UK and then moving to the States starting in middle school, I didn't necessarily feel that connection. Like if anything, which I thought was very strange at first, because you would think that, okay, I'm Black too, but of course at that time I was a British kid with the British accent, and they didn't know what to do with me. So there was this kind of resistance towards me. And even one of my cousins, who is of Ghanaian descent, he was born here, but I would argue culturally, he's definitely more African in the way he presents himself. He's told me that even among Black Americans, they've said to him, oh, you're one of us, but not really.